Welcome to the Eric Brady Podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me. Episode 32, VE Day and Afterwards. Eric, what do you remember about the Victory in Europe celebrations at the end of the war with Germany?
A certain amount. I've seen the films and videos of the celebrations in central London and around Buckingham Palace. But my parents and I, and my young brother, went out for a walk in the evening just to see what the neighbours were doing because nothing had been arranged. And there were a few bonfires in bits of wasteland that were about. But there was no singing, no celebrating really. And we just walked around the neighbourhood for a little while and then went back home. In a way, for us, the VE Day was almost an anticlimax because there'd been all the war that we'd gone through, of course, as everyone had. And then as the armies had closed in on Germany and then Berlin, we would get notifications over the radio, sometimes as an emergency broadcast, that vast areas of Germany and occupied territories have been surrendered. And I remember on one occasion, Heligoland had just been reported as being surrendered. I had no idea where Heligoland was, but my mother was excited. My father was on the allotment and she wanted me to dash across to tell him. I was not much in the way of dashing because of my injured ankle, so I borrowed my brother's three-wheeler bike and went across. And my father said, oh, right, and carried on digging. So as the armies closed still more on Berlin, both with the Russians from the east and the other allies closing up from the south, that was a foregone conclusion. And some of us couldn't understand why, in fact, the Germans kept on fighting as long as they did, when it was clear that they had no hope of winning the war. So when it actually came to VE Day, for certainly us in our part of southeast London, it was quiet and really uneventful. And I went to school the next day, as usual.
Did you have much contact with Germans after the war or even during the war?
After I arrived at Queen Mary's Hospital, Carshalton, a nurse one day took me to one side into the bathroom, not to give me a bath or anything, but to talk to me in English, but with a very heavy accent, nearly in tears. She said, "You mustn't blame the Germans for you being injured. You've got to remember," she said, "Hitler was an Austrian, not a German, and a lot of Germans didn't like him and actually escaped to get away as Hitler established his rule in Germany." And she said, "I was one of those that wanted to get away, so please don't blame me for your injuries or any Germans." At that time, I couldn't really understand why she was so upset, because she'd been in England, she hadn't been the bomber pilot, so what had she got to be upset about? So my first ever meeting with a German was a bit surprising to me. Some years later, when still a boy, I was needing to stay with the family while my mother was in hospital having a neck operation. And while I was there, this family invited a German prisoner of war to their house for Sunday tea. And I stared at him. And to me, it was a bit surprising because he just looked an ordinary fella. You wouldn't have distinguished him from an Englishman. I was just surprised, and I must have just stared at him quite a bit as well. And then we watched him go off down the street back to the prisoner of war camp. This, of course, was during the period after the war, and prisoners of war were allowed a certain amount of freedom, including being able to go out to English families for a meal or to spend time with them. When my mother heard that, she was absolutely appalled and would never speak to that family again. But really what happened subsequently with another 3 meetings of Germans that really shook me. While I was at Rainer House undergoing the professional probation officer's course, I went out with a friend from the residential place where we were, just to walk around a bit of London, sort of quite late in the evening. And I remember that we were going by a building, 3 young men, perhaps a bit younger than me, came out of the building, shut the door, and went down the road talking in German. And I looked around for a brick to sling at them. I was absolutely consumed with fear and hatred. I'd never met these guys before. And they walked off down the road before I could actually do anything. And I was so worried about my reaction to this, which was totally alien to me, that I talked it over with the student. And the student reminded me of a lecture that we'd gone to on psychology, one of the many. And there the lecturer had talked about 3 levels of consciousness. That there was a conscious, as it were, the surface consciousness of things that we're used to, point that we're living, walking down the road, doing this broadcast and so on, that I'm concentrating on. But there was a subconscious merging into the conscious and the unconscious. And memories could be contained within the subconscious, and the emotions around them contained in the unconscious. And I told him about the school and being buried in all the circumstances of that. And he said that he reckons that what had happened was that I'd repressed a lot of these memories and feelings and emotions around being bombed and injured into the unconscious. And suddenly meeting the Germans so unexpectedly was caused the emotions to be triggered. And that made a lot of sense to me. Then several years later, in the town where I was working as a probation officer, they had a parade. It was the Festival of Flowers or something, and I remember Prince Charles came, and not that I met him, and they had a big parade through the town. And among the parades of Boy Scouts, Army and RAF cadets in this procession, there was a band, I think it was of the Coldstream Guards, and I knew that there was also going to be a German band. And I thought, well, I'll be very mature and sensible about this. And what I do, I will make a point of photographing the English band, photograph the German band as they came through, and I will put the 2 side by side in a photograph album. And so I watched the parade, camera at the ready, and photographed the British Army band coming through. No problems at all. Then there came some other people marching along, and then came the German band round the corner. Leading them was the conductor, beaming all over his face and conducting, and his band marching behind him. And to my horror, all the people watching the parade cheered them as loudly as they cheered the British band. And again, those feelings erupted again. And I didn't look around for anything to throw at them. But what seared through my mind was that those Brits, the English people, were cheering the German band, that if it hadn't been for the RAF in the Battle of Britain, and their continuing operations, and the Army and the Navy, that German band would have been a Nazi band marching through our town as an occupying force. And I found that those emotions that I'd had were still there, not buried at all or dealt with. Later, my wife wanted to see The Sound of Music, the musical, which actually I loved for most of the time. But there came the time when the German forces were looking for the Von Trapp family, if you're familiar with the musical. And what they did in this theatre was to have brown shirts running around the auditorium, flashing torches and shouting in German. I had an aisle seat, and one of these guys went charging by me. Now, it was a terrific theatre, I'm sure, but again, this emotion surged up, and I stood half out of my seat to go and attack him. And I found that the emotions had not been dealt with, even after all those years. Subsequently, my wife and I often went abroad, or quite often, and there we met many Germans, and I never had any of those same reactions. In fact, we were in an isolated village at one place, and a family of Germans came up to me and asked if we were going back to the capital city on the coast. And I said yes. And he said, well, would you give us a lift, please? We booked a taxi to bring us here, and he's going to come back at 5 o'clock. And this was only 1 o'clock, and they'd exhausted the interesting bits of the village. I had no reaction at all. I said, yeah, sure, get in. We piled into the car, and they were really cramped in the back because it wasn't a big car. And we drove off. And I had no emotional reaction at all. We didn't talk about the war, obviously, even though one of them, the man, was white-haired and presumably had been involved in the war in some way or another. But I had no emotional reactions. And I think it was the unexpectedness of meeting those situations in those other 3 occasions that triggered that unconscious memory. And I think it shows how long bad memories can last.
To buy your copy of Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me to read alongside the series, go to ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.